Let's face it, history hasn't been particularly kind to women. They've been considered property, they couldn't vote until 1920, and they're still often paid less than the average man for the same or similar job. But when it comes to intentionally inflicting pain on them, well, that's on a whole other level. Here are 10 of the most brutal ways in which women were punished throughout history, and some of these techniques are still employed in some parts of the world to this day. Number 1. Spanish donkey. The Spanish donkey, also known as the wooden horse, the chevalet, the cavalletto, squarciapale, and the union mule, was a device that was used throughout medieval times and during the Spanish Inquisition. A similar contraption was also used on free slaves after the Civil War. It consists of a sharp triangular wedge that's supported by either 2 or 4 legs. A woman would be forced to straddle the pointed end, which was sometimes covered in spikes, so that their lower regions would become injured. Typically, the victim would be left unable to walk without experiencing pain. In some cases, a woman would die due to blood loss, and women who were thought to deserve extra punishment had weights put on their legs. This added weight could cause damage to the woman's bones and internal organs. Once put in place, a woman would often be paraded through town in that predicament and subsequently tarred and feathered. Number 2. Pear of anguish. This device, also known as the mouth pear, was allegedly used to punish women starting from the early modern period between 1400 to 1800. The pear-shaped metal body is divided into spoon-like segments, which were often spiked at the end, that can spread apart through a spring or by turning a key. It would be inserted into one of the woman's orifices in order to cause often irreversible damage. Some scholars have disputed historical accounts of the pear being used because the actual employment of such a device seemed suspiciously implausible. To this day, this genuine utility of these pears is unknown. However, an early mention of them were in author F.D. Cavalli's General Inventory of the History of Thieves, which was written in 1639. In that book, the invention of the device is credited to the character named Captain Gachereau de Pailloy, who robbed his victims through the use of a mechanical gag, which would subdue them while he and his accomplices raided their homes. Throughout history, there have been other mentions of pears of anguish, but many still believe that they were created to shock rather than actually inflict pain. And hopefully that's true, because if not, ouch. Regardless of legitimate evidence of these devices being used, there are still plenty of examples of them being displayed in museums. Number 3. Burning at the stake. This method of punishment actually dates back to Old Babylonia in the 18th century BC, and it has been employed through several points in history, including ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, medieval times, the Spanish Inquisition, and onward. Among the main reasons women were put to death this way included due to crimes they were alleged to have committed, their religions, or their race. One of the most notorious individuals who was burned at the stake was Joan of Arc. Death by fire continued on throughout the colonies of America, although it should be noted that none of the women accused of witchcraft in Salem, Massachusetts were killed this way. They were all hanged, but nevertheless, the first woman to have died this way was a servant, the typical term for an enslaved person at the time, named Maria. She was accused of burning 2 houses down. According to the Epsy file on U.S. executions from 1608 to 2002, the last known victim of a fiery death in America was another black woman in the year 1805. But the last woman who was reportedly sentenced to be burned at the stake was during the Spanish Inquisition in 1826, which is kind of crazy because that was not even 200 years ago. Throughout history, however, in some cases, a rope was tied around the woman's neck, and she would be strangled before the flames ever reached her body. Not all were lucky, though, sometimes intentionally or unintentionally, like the case of Catherine Hayes, who was killed in May 1726. The fire was somehow lit too quickly, and she was forced to die a painful death, which the executioner couldn't cut off her oxygen flow in time. Also, some people were met with a more merciful consolation. They were given bags of gunpowder to tie between their legs and under each arm. That way the bags would explode, causing the victim to be killed faster than waiting to be engulfed in flames. But like with the strangulation method, was not always effective. For instance, if the wind that day was too strong or if the wood used was too green, extensive suffering seemed unavoidable. It's also noting that, contrary to popular belief, none of the women accused of witchcraft in Salem, Massachusetts, were burned to death. Instead, they were all hanged. Other mechanisms were used in history to accomplish similar results, including the brazen bull, which was a metal structure in the form of a bull that was heated and then condemned person was put inside of it. Number 4. Stoning. This punishment, just like the last one, is pretty self-explanatory. It involves a group of people throwing rocks at someone until they pass away. Religious writings even suggest this form of punishment for a number of different offenses, like breaking Sabbath, cursing God, rebellion against parents, having inappropriate relations with animals or family members, or engaging in adultery. We like to think of this practice taking place in ancient times, which, of course, it did. But it's still a legitimate punishment for people today in countries like Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Iran, Somalia, and Yemen. However, the practice is condemned by international law and the United Nations. Rupert Colville, spokesperson for the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, said, "Under international law, stoning people to death constitutes torture or other cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment and is thus clearly prohibited." Further, he mentioned how women around the world are more likely to be stoned than men, due to deeply entrenched discrimination and stereotyping against them, including among law enforcement and judicial officers. Number 5. The Republican marriage. A Republican marriage would take place after forcing a man and a woman out of their clothing, tying them together, and throwing them into the river. Some reports stated that the man and woman were meant to stand naked and tied for a prolonged period of time, likely to add to their humiliation. This was primarily done to anyone, but perhaps more frequently to priests and nuns, during the reign of terror of the French Revolution between 1793 and 1794, and were ordered by Jean-Baptiste Carrier. However, like the pair of anguish, this form of punishment has also met skepticism when it comes to some historians. Apparently, people living in France throughout 1793 and 1794 reported hearing about Republican marriages taking place. No one ever claimed to have been an eyewitness to one. There was such little evidence of these practices actually being used that the assistant prosecutor and defense at Carrier's trial mentioned that fact and had accusations around Republican marriages crossed off the indictment by the president of the jury. Never fear, however, because the remaining facts surrounding the Reign of Terror were sufficient enough for Carrier and several of his accomplices to be sentenced to death anyway. In terms of the etymology of the term, it appears to be making a mockery of secular marriages. Books have mentioned parents being horrified when their children planned a Republican wedding instead of one in the local church. Number 6. The iron chair. Like burning at the stake, this type of punishment involves fire, but this one involves furniture, and likely the most uncomfortable chair you could ever own. Similarly to others on this list, this method was also used on both sexes, but primarily women were subjected to it for some reason. The chair used for this was covered in razor-sharp spikes, ranging from 500 to 1,500. Women would be forced to sit on it for hours, eventually dying from blood loss. Fires lit in compartments under the chair would also aid in the death by slowly roasting the victim. This death sentence was given to women who committed several crimes, including adultery, witchcraft, and murder. The iron chair was introduced during the Middle Ages, used in Europe until the late 1800s. A similar method was used in China from 1701 to the 1900s, and, according to the Science Museum in London, was made from wood with 12 steel blades in the arm, back, footrests, and seat. The iron chair was also used throughout history to elicit confessions from people by having them watch others being subjected to that type of punishment. In recent history, this form of punishment has been documented in countries like North Korea. In fact, it's been reported that the use of iron chairs is a common practice in prisons there. Number 7. Catherine's Wheel. Not to be confused with the British alternative rock band of the same name in the 1990s, this horrific punishment device was named after a woman that couldn't seem to kill, Saint Catherine of Alexandria. As a devout follower, Catherine was sentenced to death during the persecution of Christians under Emperor Maxinius. This is known lore that when Saint Catherine touched the wheel, it became broken and cracked. She would ultimately meet her demise after being beheaded. Before that legendary day, it was called a breaking wheel. Interestingly enough, and going back to another woman on this list, Joan of Arc reportedly heard the voice of St. Catherine nearly 1,000 years after her death, and it was inspired by her words to go down the path of martyrdom. Further, iconography of St. Catherine, including the portrait by Michelangelo, feature her with the broken wheel, or a smaller version of it as seen in her hands. Similarly, a sword, which was used as a substitute to end her life, is also often included in these images. But the wheel itself was sometimes covered in spikes, and the unfortunate victim would have their backs strapped to it, and then a club or other instrument would be used to bash their limbs. Death by the Catherine's wheel was often a slow process, and some people did not get the release of death until 4 days of torture. It was used throughout Europe and the rest of the world, but in colonial America, several enslaved people were killed on one of these wheels. Outside the context of brutal torture, and aside from the band mentioned earlier, this device has continually been mentioned in popular culture throughout history, including several songs called Catherine Wheel, 2 novels called The Catherine Wheel, and many others. Also, Catherine Wheel was the older name for the cartwheel in gymnastics, and currently is a type of spoked window and a type of flowering evergreen. Moreover, several people, organizations, and places include Catherine wheels in their coat of arms. Number 8. The Breast Ripper. As the name suggests, this device is used to maim a woman's body. Sometimes the prongs would even be heated. In other forms, it also refers to as the iron spider or simply the spider. The device included 4 claws that were used to rip exactly what the name says it did. Women subjected to this punishment were often unmarried mothers and those accused of adultery. Besides inflicting pain, the purpose of this was to use it to mark their bodies of the female victims forever. Thankfully for all women, this instrument wasn't believed to have been used after the end of the Middle Ages. Number 9. Foot binding. Although perhaps not with the intention to torture young girls, foot binding was a beautification process and did just that, torture and continue to torture the poor women who were forced to be disabled or in the very least have greater limitations in working and walking than their non-bound counterparts for the rest of their lives. The process started on girls as young as 4 or 5 years of age. On a positive note, older women who underwent foot binding young are often said to feel less pain because young bones are soft and break more easily. Wealthy Chinese families often bound their daughters' feet in order to attract worthy male suitors, and it was considered beautiful for a woman to have small and dainty feet, known as lotus feet. Fittingly, the shoes made for these girls were called lotus shoes. It was said that the ideal foot lengths were the golden lotus at 3 inches and the silver lotus at 4. Anything larger than those 2 measurements were considered an iron lotus and unacceptable. In order to get the desired results, a girl's foot would be bound with silk cloth, which would cause the bones and arches to break. Girls were often encouraged to walk around while their feet were bound to aid in the breakage. The cloths would be applied tighter and tighter until the golden or silver lotus was achieved. The process existed in China for over 1,000 years, and it's thought to have originated during the time of the 10th century Emperor Li Yu of southern Tang, just before the Song dynasty. Li Yu allegedly created a 6-foot lotus decorated with precious stones and pearls before asking a woman named Yan Yang to bind her feet in white silk into the shape of the crescent moon and perform a dance on the points of her feet on it. Her dance was said to be so beautiful and graceful that others sought to replicate it. Some of the earliest references to foot binding appeared around 1100 in poems that allude to the practice. It is said that some women bound their feet for their entire lives, while some let the binding lapse after they get married. In recent time, it has been estimated that by 19th century, 40 to 50% of all Chinese women were the victim of foot binding, and that those numbers rose to 100% among the upper class Han Chinese women. However, even given these statistics, it's said that richer and higher class women gave up the practice before poorer rural women. But as time went on, activists started to voice their opposition to the practice, and many joined clubs known as anti-foot binding groups to work in numbers to insist on banning it. Many women of these groups pledged not to bind their daughters' feet or marry their sons off to girls with bound feet. In 1902, Empress Dowager Cixi issued an anti-foot binding edict, but it was quickly rescinded. Thus, the campaigning continued. Some supporters identified it as feminists, while others pushed to reform based on patriotism. An article in Beijing Women's News was run in 1906 that blamed women with bound feet for being a national weakness in the eyes of other nations. Other reformers, like Liang Kuo, was influenced by social Darwinism and suggests that women with bound feet produced weak sons. But he also said, as long as foot binding remains in practice, women's education can never flourish. Moreover, he was disappointed that foreigners opened up the first schools for women in China. He thought that Chinese women should be educated by other Chinese people. Finally, at the urging of missionaries and Chinese citizens alike, the Republic of China government banned foot binding in 1912. Although the ban was not actively implemented in some regions, it was very successful. In 1929, a survey of one province, there was only 2.3% of girls born before 1910 had unbound feet, showed that 95% of them were unbound at that time. Similarly, in the region of South Beijing, Dijiang, where over 99% of women once had bound feet, no new cases were found in girls born after 1919. Although the practice was considered to have been virtually disappeared by 1949 in most parts of China, some young girls and women continued foot binding in secret, and their mothers would trick government officials when they came around for inspections by placing the bound feet into bigger shoes. But the last reported case of foot binding was in 1957. And as stigmatization continued, the last Chinese shoe factory making lotus shoes, the Zhixiang Shoe Factory in Harbin, was closed in 1999, likely due to lack of demand. In modern times, of the small amount of women who had bound feet, some report regretting having it done to them. One woman said that she regretted engaging in the process because now, instead of standing for high class and privilege, bound feet stand for female subjugation. She commented that she couldn't dance or move properly, but she also said that she didn't really have a choice at the time because if you don't bind your feet, you wouldn't have anyone to marry you. Another woman reported that sometimes her feet hurt so badly that she can't even put them on the ground. Thankfully, the practice has pretty much been abolished, so girls and women no longer needlessly suffer like that. Number 10. Corsets. Like foot binding, corsets are thought to have been used to conform women into unrealistic beauty standards. The corset is a support garment that is worn to hold and train the torso into a desired shape, traditionally a smaller waist and larger bottom, aka the hourglass. They were also used to support and exaggerate a woman's chest. Both men and women have been known to wear corsets throughout history, but they were more prevalent among females. They've been around for 500 years, and the first evidence of them was referred to as stays in the 16th century. In fact, during Catherine de Medicis' reign in France, between 1547 to 1559, she banned women with thick waists from attending court. However, corsets did not become popular as underwear until the 18th century. Some women still wear corsets or versions of them to this day. Although modern versions, as they are made for lacing or boning, that merely imitate historical corsets, are said to not aim at permanently deforming the body like the old-fashioned ones. In terms of etymology, the word corset comes from the Old French word corps, means body or little body. The person who makes them participates in the profession known as courtistry. According to the Guinness Book of World Records, listed a woman named Kathy Young as having the smallest waist on a living person and a waist measuring 15 inches after 1998. Despite their popularity, tightly laced corsets, mostly those used in the past, but some in modern times too, can cause detrimental effects. They can restrict breathing, which can lead to faintness, and continued or elongated use can cause waist deformity, specifically rib deformities. Corsets can also restrict and reposition vital organs, which could cause poor digestion, and they can cause the muscles in the back to atrophy. Waste, no pun intended, away. In order to avoid these consequences, a slim waist can instead be achieved through exercises that tone the oblique muscles, such as sit-ups, abdominal crunches, and plank poses. Eating a well-balanced and healthy diet won't hurt either. On the positive side, special corset-like braces have been designed to specifically help people with spinal problems like scoliosis or other back pain by offering lumbar support. Some corsets have also been found to aid in vigorous activity like playing tennis, bicycling, or horseback riding, as well as for maternity wear. Corsets are also known to temporarily improve mobility and flexibility in those who are overweight because they tightly support abdominal muscles. Further, they compress the stomach, so it may cause the wearer to eat less. So while specifically designed corsets can improve someone's overall quality of life, others can cause permanent detriments to a person's muscles, organs, and bones.